The air in Manhattan's superior courtroom 3B was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken triumph. Victoria Devereux, poised to become the city's most notorious divorcee, smoothed her silk dress, her eyes fixed on the man who was about to make her phenomenally wealthy billionaire, Damian Westwood. The judge was about to finalize a settlement that would sever Damian's marriage to his long-absent wife, a woman no one had seen in almost a year. But just as the gavel was about to fall, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Every head turned, and in the doorway stood a ghost from Damian's past, his wife Jessica, her hands resting on a stomach so round, so undeniably pregnant, it silenced the entire room. Victoria's perfectly composed face crumbled, her victory turning to ash as she stared at the one complication she never saw coming. The silence in courtroom 3B was a living entity. It pressed in on all sides, heavy and suffocating. Before the door opened, the room had been a theater of quiet, ruthless efficiency. On one side sat Damian Westwood, the titan of Westwood Global Logistics, a man whose face was more familiar from the cover of Forbes than from any personal scandal. He was a statue carved from Italian marble and bespoke Brioni suits, his expression an unreadable mask of stoicism. Beside him, his lawyer Garrett Finch was a predator in pinstripes, his briefcase containing documents that would surgically remove a 9-year marriage from his client's life. On the other side, a picture of calculated victory, sat Victoria Devereux. She wasn't merely a mistress, she was Damian's chief operating officer, a woman who had climbed the corporate ladder and then climbed right into its owner's bed. Her lawyer Conrad Jennings preened beside her, confident in the ironclad prenuptial agreement and the mountain of evidence detailing the irretrievable breakdown of the Westwood marriage. Victoria's narrative was simple and effective. She was the one who understood Damian, the one who stood by him while his wife Jessica had simply vanished. The press had eaten it up, painting Jessica Peterson as a flighty, unstable woman who couldn't handle the pressures of being a billionaire's wife. Judge Miranda Hayes, a woman known for her impatience with theatrics, cleared her throat, her gaze fixed on the papers before her. "We are here to finalize the dissolution of the marriage between Damian Westwood and Jessica Peterson. Ms. Peterson has been duly served and has failed to appear or respond. Therefore, the court is prepared to rule in favor of the plaintiff's proposed settlement." It was at that precise moment that the creak of the courtroom doors sliced through the judge's voice. The intrusion was so unexpected that the court officer barely had time to move. All eyes swiveled to the back. The woman who stood there was not the waifish, broken figure the tabloids had speculated about. Jessica Peterson was taller than most, remembered her honey blonde hair pulled back into a simple, elegant ponytail. She wore a plain, navy blue maternity dress, its simplicity only serving to accentuate the dramatic swell of her abdomen. She was by any estimation at least 8 months pregnant. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue-green, swept the room calm and deliberate. They passed over the gawking reporters, the stern face of the judge, and the visibly flustered lawyers. They lingered for a fraction of a second on Victoria, whose mask of smug composure had cracked, revealing a fissure of pure, unadulterated shock. Finally, her gaze landed on Damian. For the first time that day, Damian's stoic facade broke. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. His knuckles resting on the polished table were white. He didn't look angry or even surprised. He looked haunted. A woman with a sensible bob haircut and a determined expression stepped forward from behind Jessica. "Your Honor," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "My name is Brenda Walsh. I am representing Mrs. Jessica Peterson Westwood. We are here to contest this divorce." The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of whispers. Conrad Jennings shot to his feet. "Objection! This is a mockery." Mrs. Peterson, or whatever she calls herself now, waived her right to appear. Brenda Walsh didn't even flinch. She simply walked beside her client, guiding Jessica slowly toward the front of the courtroom. The journey felt like a mile. With every step Jessica took, the truth of her condition became more undeniable. This wasn't a trick of the light or a padded dress. This was a baby. A Westwood baby. Victoria Devereaux felt the blood drain from her face. Her entire future was predicated on a single, simple fact: Damien had no heirs. The prenuptial agreement was generous, but true power, the kind she craved, came from legacy. She was meant to be the one to give him that. She was supposed to be the mother of the next Westwood dynasty, not this ghost from the past. Her perfectly manicured hand clenched into a fist under the table, her nails digging into her palm. Jessica stopped before the bench, her hand ever leaving her stomach, a gesture that was both protective and defiant. She looked directly at Judge Hayes. "Your Honor," Jessica said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the hysteria everyone expected. "My apologies for my tardiness. It seems I was not properly informed of the true nature of these proceedings. I am here to ensure that the court has all the relevant facts before making its decision." Judge Hayes stared down at her, her expression unreadable. She looked from Jessica's swollen belly to Damien's pale, rigid face, then to Victoria's barely concealed fury. The simple, clean divorce she had anticipated for her 10:00 a.m. slot had just exploded into the society trial of the decade. "Ms. Walsh," the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you and your client are creating quite a disruption. You had better have a very good reason for it." Brenda Walsh smiled a thin, sharp smile that promised bloodshed. "Oh, we do, Your Honor," she said, placing a protective hand on Jessica's shoulder. "We have a reason that is currently about 9 pounds and kicking." The courtroom was sealed. Judge Hayes, sensing the media frenzy about to boil over, had cleared the gallery of all non-essential personnel, leaving only the principal players locked in a pressure cooker of tension. The air crackled. Victoria Devereaux was now vibrating with a rage she struggled to contain, her whispers to her lawyer, Conrad Jennings, growing more frantic and sharp. Damien Westwood remained silent, his gaze fixed on the polished grain of the defense table, as if trying to decipher a hidden message within the wood. "Mrs. Peterson Westwood," Judge Hayes began, her tone brooking no nonsense. "You have been absent for 10 months. 10 months during which your husband filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment. The court has records of multiple attempts to serve you papers which were left unanswered. You cannot simply walk in here on the final day and expect to derail these proceedings." Brenda Walsh stepped forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client was not in a position to respond. She was dealing with a significant, life-altering medical situation, one that her husband was fully aware of before she left." Garrett Finch, Damien's lawyer, rose smoothly. "Objection. That is a baseless and inflammatory accusation. My client had no knowledge of any medical situation. He believed his wife left him without cause or explanation." "Then perhaps Mr. Westwood has a poor memory," Brenda retorted, her eyes glinting. "I'd like to call my client Jessica Peterson Westwood to the stand." A wave of shock rippled through the room. This was a bold, unexpected move. Usually such a reveal would be used as leverage in backroom negotiations. Brenda Walsh was throwing her grenade right into the center of the room. Jessica moved to the witness stand with a slow, deliberate grace. After being sworn in, she settled into the chair, adjusting for her belly. She looked small in the large wooden chair, yet she possessed an undeniable aura of strength. "Jessica," Brenda began, her voice gentle but firm, "please tell the court why you left your marital home in New York last November." Jessica took a deep breath, her eyes finding Damien's for a brief, searing moment. He finally looked up, and the connection was electric. "I left," she said, her voice steady, "because I discovered my husband was having an affair with his chief operating officer, Ms. Victoria Devereaux." Victoria gasped, a theatrical sound of indignation. "That is a lie. We only became involved after she abandoned him." "Silence, Ms. Devereaux." Judge Hayes snapped her gavel, hitting the block with a sharp crack. "You will have your turn. Proceed, Ms. Walsh." "How did you discover this affair, Jessica?" "It wasn't one thing," Jessica explained, her gaze distant, as if replaying a painful memory. "It was 1,000 small things. Late nights at the office that stretched until morning, a sudden obsession with his phone. But the proof was in the details. Damien is a meticulous man. He's also a creature of habit. His credit card statements used to be predictable. Then suddenly there were charges for a suite at the Carlyle every Tuesday and Thursday, for months, and charges from a high-end lingerie boutique, La Perla, for items that were certainly not my size. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The final piece was a lease agreement I found in his study, for a penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, leased by a shell corporation, but the utility bills were being paid by Westwood Global. The name on the tenant agreement was Victoria Devereaux. Finch was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is conjecture. A list of circumstantial grievances does not justify desertion." "I am not finished," Jessica said, her voice cutting through his objection. She looked directly at Damien. "The night I found the lease, I confronted him. He didn't deny it. He told me it was complicated. He asked for time. I told him I needed space to think that I was going to my family's home in Boulder to clear my head. We agreed to speak in a week." Brenda nodded. "And what happened during that week, Jessica?" Jessica's voice trembled for the first time. "Nothing. He never called." A week turned into 2. Then a month. The next communication I received from my husband was a courier delivering divorce papers to my parents' front door. "And at this point," Brenda said, her voice dropping, becoming more resonant, "you had discovered something else, hadn't you?" Jessica placed both hands on her belly. "Yes. 2 weeks after I arrived in Colorado, I found out I was pregnant." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Victoria let out a choked sound, a mix of disbelief and fury. Brenda moved in for the kill. "And did you inform your husband?" "Of course I did," Jessica said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "I called him immediately. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail. I sent him a text message with a picture of the positive pregnancy test. I sent a registered letter including a note from my doctor confirming the pregnancy and the due date. I have records of all of it." And she looked at the judge, her expression pleading. "He knew. He has known for 7 months. He chose to ignore it and proceed with this divorce as if his child, our child, didn't exist." The accusation was stunning. It recast Damien not as a wronged husband, but as a monster of cold indifference. Garrett Finch was pale, blindsided. He looked at Damien, whose face was now a thunderous mask of confusion and anger. "Mr. Westwood," Judge Hayes said, her voice sharp as glass, "is this true? Were you aware of your wife's pregnancy?" Before Damien could answer, Garrett Finch spoke for him. "Your Honor, my client denies these outrageous claims. He received no such voicemail, text message, or letter. This is a desperate last-minute fabrication by a woman trying to extort a larger settlement." "A fabrication?" Brenda's voice was laced with ice. "Then how does your client explain the private investigator he hired 3 months ago, a Mr. Paul Stadler, whose explicit task was to monitor my client in Boulder, Colorado. An investigator who reported back to Mr. Westwood weekly with photographs. Photographs, I might add, that would have clearly shown my client's advancing pregnancy. She slapped a file down on the table. We have subpoenaed Mr. Stadler. He is prepared to testify that he personally informed Mr. Westwood 6 weeks ago that Mrs. Peterson Westwood was, and I quote, very obviously and heavily pregnant. The room fell into a deathly hush. This was no longer a he said, she said. This was a documented, verifiable fact. Damien had known. He had known, and he had sat there in court, ready to sign away his marriage, while his pregnant wife was treated as a ghost. Victoria stared at Damien, her eyes wide with betrayal. He had known. He had known there was a baby, and he hadn't told her. Her entire plan, her future, was built on a lie he had allowed her to believe. Damien finally pushed his chair back and stood up his towering frame, seeming to suck all the air out of the room. He didn't look at his lawyer or his mistress. He looked only at Jessica, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. Jessica, he said, his voice a low growl. We need to talk. 5 years earlier, the world of Damien and Jessica had not been a courtroom, but a sprawling, empty plot of land in upstate New York overlooking the Hudson River. It was all rolling hills and ancient oak trees, a blank canvas where they planned to build their life. Damien, already a force in the business world, saw it as a legacy project. But for Jessica, an architect with a rising reputation for her warm, human-centric designs, it was a love letter written in steel, glass, and stone. They had walked the grounds for hours, their hands intertwined, dreaming aloud. The main house will go here, she'd said, pointing to the highest crest. All glass on the west side so we can watch the sunset over the river every single night. I want a library. Damien had countered, a rare, easy smile on his face. Floor to ceiling, with one of those rolling ladders like in a movie. It'll have a fireplace, she'd added, and 2 big, worn leather armchairs where we'll sit when we're old and gray reading to our grandchildren. The dream was so vivid, they could almost taste it. He was the unstoppable engine, and she was the brilliant artist who gave his ambition a soul. In those early years, their partnership felt invincible. She wasn't just a billionaire's wife. She was his intellectual equal, his most trusted confidant. He'd bring home complex logistics problems from Westwood Global, and she'd sketch out flowcharts on her design pads, her spatial reasoning often finding elegant solutions his own team had missed. She designed the award-winning lobby of his new headquarters in downtown Manhattan, a space that was both imposing and inviting, a perfect reflection of the man she loved. The first cracks in their foundation were almost invisible. Westwood Global's expansion into Asia demanded more of his time. The late-night strategy sessions in their living room were replaced by weeks-long trips to Shanghai and Tokyo. The easy smiles were replaced by a perpetual tension in his jaw. He was conquering the world, but he was losing his home. Jessica tried to bridge the distance. She flew to meet him in Hong Kong for a surprise anniversary dinner, only to spend most of it alone in a hotel suite while he was pulled into an unavoidable meeting. She tried to get him excited about the final blueprints for their Hudson River house, but he'd just glance at them, his mind clearly still on quarterly reports and stock prices. It looks great, Jess. Whatever you think is best. He'd say the words a casual dismissal of their shared dream. Then came Victoria Devereaux. She arrived at Westwood Global as a hungry, brilliant strategist hired from a rival firm. Jessica met her at a company gala and was immediately put on edge. Victoria wasn't just beautiful, she was a mirror of Damien's own ambition. She spoke his language, the language of acquisitions, market shares, and hostile takeovers. When she looked at Damien, she didn't see a husband. She saw a king, and she was offering him a throne in a kingdom he could rule with her at his side. Jessica watched as their professional relationship bled into something else. Victoria became his work wife, the one he called first with good news, the one he leaned on during a crisis. The two big leather armchairs in Jessica's blueprints started to feel like a foolish, naive fantasy. The decline was a slow, painful erosion. Intimate dinners were replaced by takeout eaten in silence. Shared laughter was replaced by the constant tapping of his thumbs on a phone that was suddenly always angled away from her. He was physically present, but emotionally a million miles away, in a world she was no longer invited to enter. She felt like a ghost in her own marriage, haunting the hallways of their Fifth Avenue apartment. The night she found the lease for Victoria's apartment was not a moment of screaming or shattered glass. It was a moment of profound, soul-crushing quiet. She held the paper in her hand, the crisp document a death certificate for her marriage. She saw the dates. The affair hadn't been a recent mistake. It had been going on for over a year. A parallel life he had been living while she was still trying to pick out paint colors for their dream home. She confronted him in his study, the room where they had once dreamed up their future. He was standing by the window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city. She laid the lease on his desk. He turned, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man she had married, a flash of panic, of guilt. But it was quickly extinguished, replaced by the cool, controlled mask of the CEO. "Jess, it's complicated." He'd said the words, a stunning understatement. "Complicated," she had whispered the sound, barely audible. "You have been living a double life, Damien. You've been building an empire with her while our own home, the one I designed for us for our family, is just a set of drawings you don't even look at anymore." "That's not fair," he'd said, his voice defensive. The business is your life now," she finished for him. "And there's no room for me in it, or for us." She told him she was leaving, going to Boulder. She needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with his lies. "I need time to think," she'd said. "We'll talk in a week." He had simply nodded, his relief palpable. He didn't fight for her. He didn't beg her to stay. He let her walk out of the door, out of his life, and he never called. That silence was more painful than any argument. It was the sound of her own irrelevance. And as she flew across the country, she had no idea that a tiny, secret life was already beginning inside her, a final unbreakable link to the man who had so thoroughly broken her heart. Boulder, Colorado was the antithesis of her life in New York. The jagged, imposing skyline of Manhattan was replaced by the majestic, solid presence of the Flatirons. The frantic energy of the city gave way to a calmer, more deliberate pace. Jessica stayed in the small guest house behind her parents' home, a place filled with the comforting scent of her mother's baking and her father's wood workshop. For the first few weeks, she did little more than sleep and take long, solitary hikes in the mountain air, trying to scrub the stench of betrayal from her soul. The first week passed in agonizing silence. Her phone remained stubbornly quiet. She checked it obsessively, her heart leaping at every notification only to have it plummet when it was just a news alert or a junk email. He wasn't going to call. The promise to talk in a week had been a lie, a simple tactic to get her out of the way so he could continue his life with Victoria uninterrupted. The realization was a cold, hard stone in her gut. By the end of the second week, a different kind of unease began to set in. A persistent fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. A strange metallic taste in her mouth. A sudden aversion to coffee, a drink she had loved her entire life. She chalked it up to stress and grief. Her body was simply reacting to the trauma of her shattered marriage. But one morning while brushing her teeth, the scent of mint toothpaste sent a violent wave of nausea through her. She barely made it to the toilet. Her mother, a retired nurse named Mary, found her moments later pale and trembling on the bathroom floor. Mary's expression was one of knowing sympathy. She didn't ask questions. She simply left and returned 10 minutes later with a small box from the local pharmacy. "Just in case, sweetie," she said softly, placing it on the vanity. Jessica stared at the pregnancy test with a sense of dread. It felt impossible. A cruel joke by the universe. They had tried for years to have a child. They had talked to specialists, endured heartbreaking cycles of hope and disappointment, and had finally resigned themselves to the idea that it might just be the two of them. That shared struggle, she now realized, had been another casualty of his affair. He had likely been with Victoria during the very months they were supposedly trying to build their family. With trembling hands, she took the test. The 2 minutes she had to wait felt like an eternity. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was almost certain it would be negative, another disappointment, in a long line of them. But it wasn't. 2 pink lines appeared, stark and unambiguous. Pregnant. Jessica didn't cry. She didn't feel joy. She felt a profound and dizzying sense of shock followed by a wave of cold, clarifying anger. Damien had not only broken their vows and their trust, he had abandoned her at the most vulnerable moment of her life. This child, their child, was conceived during the dying embers of their marriage, a testament to a love that he had already discarded. Her first instinct was to call him, to scream at him, to force him to acknowledge what he had done. She dialed his number, her thumb hovering over the call button. But then she stopped. What would it accomplish? He would likely see it as a trap, a ploy to stop the divorce he so clearly wanted. He would accuse her of using a baby for leverage. The man who had once been her partner was now her adversary. Instead, she did what an architect does. She made a plan. She would inform him, but not in a way he could ignore or twist. It would be documented, official. She went to her doctor the next day to confirm the pregnancy. Then she sent the text message clinical direct with the photo of the test. She left the voicemail calm, factual, stating the results of her doctor's visit. And finally she sent the registered letter requiring his signature upon receipt. There would be a paper trail. There would be proof. The registered mail receipt came back with a scrawled, almost illegible signature that was undeniably his. He knew. He had the letter in his hands. And still he did not call. The silence that followed was the final confirmation. He didn't care. The baby changed nothing. He had made his choice, and his choice was Victoria. It was in that moment that Jessica's grief hardened into resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a mother. Her fight was no longer about saving her marriage. It was about protecting her child. She hired Brenda Walsh, a notoriously tough family law attorney her father knew from a local charity board. "He wants to pretend you and this baby don't exist," Brenda had said during their first meeting, her eyes flashing with righteous anger. "Fine, we'll let him. We'll let him file his papers and set his court dates. We'll let him and his mistress walk into that courtroom thinking they have won. And then, Jessica, you are going to walk in there and show them exactly what a catastrophic mistake they have made." The plan was terrifying, but it was also empowering. For months, Jessica focused on her health. She watched her body change, felt the first flutter of movement, and heard the strong, steady heartbeat on the ultrasound. She was building something new, something that was hers alone. The house on the Hudson was a dead dream, but this new life was real and tangible. Then came the private investigator. She spotted him one day, a bland man in a beige sedan parked down the street from her parents' house. He wasn't very good. She saw him again at the grocery store and a week later near the park where she walked. Brenda confirmed it through a contact, Paul Stadler, a PI often used by top-tier New York law firms. He was reporting directly to Damien. So he knew. He was not only ignoring her, but he was also spying on her. Any lingering hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding evaporated. This was a calculated strategic war, and he was treating her and their unborn child as an obstacle to be managed. "Good," Brenda had said with a grim smile. "He's creating our evidence for us. Let him watch. Let him see you thrive. Let him get comfortable. His arrogance will be his undoing." Back in the suspended reality of the courtroom, the battle lines were drawn. Judge Hayes had called a 30-minute recess, and the small room was a hive of frantic, whispered conversations. In one corner, Victoria Devereaux was having a full-blown, though quietly contained, meltdown. Her face, usually a canvas of cool control, was blotchy with rage. "You knew," she hissed at Damien, her voice a venomous whisper. "You knew she was pregnant for months, and you said nothing. You let me sit here. You let me plan. What was I, Damien? A placeholder until your fertile wife decided to return." "It's not like that, Victoria," Damien said, his voice low and strained. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time all day. "I didn't believe it. I thought it was a trick." "A trick?" She scoffed, her laugh sharp and humorless. "Does she look like a trick? She's about to give birth on the courthouse steps, and the private investigator, you were spying on her. You knew, and you lied to me. You lied to our lawyers." Garrett Finch stepped between them, his face grim. "This changes the calculus, Damien, substantially. A hidden pregnancy evidence of your prior knowledge. This is a disaster from a PR perspective, not to mention a legal one. The prenup has clauses about children. This is no longer a simple dissolution." Meanwhile, in the opposite corner, Brenda Walsh was prepping her client. "They're rattled," she said, handing Jessica a bottle of water. "Finch is a corporate shark, not a family law brawler. He's out of his element. They're going to come at you with everything they've got. They'll try to paint you as a liar, a manipulator, an unfit mother. Don't take the bait. Stay calm. Stick to the facts. The truth is your shield." Jessica nodded, her hand resting on her belly, where a flurry of kicks reminded her exactly what she was fighting for. "I'm ready," she said. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold tactical fury. Garrett Finch put Jessica back on the stand, his demeanor no longer smooth but overtly aggressive. "Mrs. Peterson Westwood," he began, pacing before her. "You claim you left because of an affair, yet you admit you had no definitive proof, just suspicions and credit card statements. Isn't it more likely that you were unhappy, that you felt overshadowed by your husband's success, and you simply ran away? I found a lease for a penthouse in your client's mistress's name paid for by his company," Jessica stated calmly. "I consider that definitive." "A corporate apartment which Ms. Devereaux, as COO, was entitled to," Finch shot back. "You jumped to a conclusion that suited your narrative. A narrative that you are now using to stage this theatrical display." He gestured towards her stomach. "Objection," Brenda called out. "Counsel is badgering the witness and making pejorative statements about her physical condition." "Sustained," Judge Hayes warned. "Watch your tone, Mr. Finch." Finch regrouped, his eyes cold. "Let's talk about this pregnancy. You claim my client is the father. But you were gone for 10 months. You lived in a separate state, leading a separate life. How can this court be certain of the child's paternity?" The question was a vile, calculated blow designed to sow doubt and humiliate her. The implication was clear: she could have been with someone else. Jessica's eyes flashed with fire, but her voice remained level. My husband and I were intimate 2 nights before I left New York. The conception date, as confirmed by 3 separate medical examinations, aligns perfectly with that timeline. I have not been with another man since. I am happy to submit to any DNA test the court requires as soon as the child is born. In fact, I insist on it. Her unwavering certainty took the wind out of Finch's sails. He shifted his attack. You also claim you tried to contact my client. A voicemail, a text message. These things can be faked, can't they? And a registered letter. You knew he was traveling extensively for business. It could have been signed by an assistant discarded as junk mail. Are you suggesting Mr. Westwood's signature was forged? Brenda interjected from her seat. Because we can bring in a handwriting expert if you'd like to go down that road. Finch ignored her. Why didn't you try harder, Mrs. Peterson Westwood? Why didn't you fly back to New York? Why didn't you show up at his office? If this was so important, why hide away in Colorado for 7 months? I wasn't hiding, Jessica said, her voice rising with emotion. I was surviving. My husband, the man I had built a life with, shattered my trust and abandoned me. He made it clear he wanted no contact. Then when I told him I was carrying his child, he responded with absolute silence. What was I supposed to do? Beg him to be a father? I was focused on a healthy pregnancy, away from the stress and the lies and the woman he had chosen over me. I was waiting for him to be a man and acknowledge his responsibility. He never did. Her words were a direct hit. She wasn't playing the victim. She was explaining her strength. Finch, seeing he was losing, played his final desperate card. He turned his attention to her mental state. Mrs. Peterson Westwood, isn't it true that you sought therapy for anxiety and stress 2 years ago, that you told your doctor you felt overwhelmed by your life? It was a low blow, digging into her private medical history. Yes, Jessica said without shame. My husband was working 80-hour weeks, we were struggling with infertility, and I was running my own architectural firm. I sought therapy to develop healthy coping mechanisms. It was the responsible thing to do. Done. Or perhaps, Finch insinuated, his voice dripping with condescension, you have a history of emotional instability, of running away when things get difficult. Perhaps this entire pregnancy is a delusion, a desperate fantasy to win back a husband who had already moved on. Before Brenda could even object, a loud, resounding bang echoed through the courtroom. It wasn't the judge's gavel. It was Damian Westwood's fist slamming down on the defense table. Every person in the room flinched. The sound was so raw, so violent, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the courtroom's decorum. Damian Westwood was on his feet, his face a mask of incandescent fury. His chair had been shoved back so hard it had nearly toppled over. Enough, he growled. The word was low, but it carried the absolute authority of a man used to commanding boardrooms and bending markets to his will. Garrett Finch froze mid-sentence, his mouth slightly agape. Victoria stared at Damien, a flicker of fear in her eyes. This was not the cold, controlled Damien she knew. This was someone else entirely. Damien, sit down, Finch hissed under his breath. This is not helping. Damien ignored him. His eyes were locked on Jessica, and for the first time she saw something beyond the guilt and the anger. She saw a glimmer of the man he used to be, the man who had once sworn to protect her. He took a step forward towards the witness stand, his presence so commanding that the court officer instinctively moved to intercept him. Mr. Westwood, Judge Hayes's voice was like a whip crack. You will return to your seat immediately, or I will have you removed for contempt. Damien stopped, but he did not sit down. He turned his gaze from Jessica to the judge, his expression resolute. Your Honor, he said, his voice now clear and powerful, resonating in the stunned silence. My lawyer is acting on my previous instructions. Instructions that were based on bad information and even worse judgment. The line of questioning he is pursuing is offensive, it is wrong, and it will stop. Now. Finch looked utterly mortified. "Damien, what are you doing?" Damien finally turned to his lawyer, his eyes blazing. "I'm ending this farce, Garrett. My wife is not unstable. She is not a liar, and she is not delusional." He then turned his gaze back to the room, his eyes sweeping over the shocked faces until they rested again on Jessica. His voice softened, but it lost none of its power. "I was aware of the pregnancy," he stated, the admission sucking the last bit of air from the room. "I received the text. I received the voicemail. I signed for the letter myself. I hired Paul Stadler. I saw the photographs. I knew." Victoria Devereaux let out a small, wounded sound, as if she'd been physically struck. It was one thing to suspect it. It was another to hear him confess it so publicly. Her humiliation was now complete and absolute. "Then why, Mr. Westwood?" Judge Hayes asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Did you proceed with this divorce, allowing your counsel to claim ignorance and slander your wife?" Damien's jaw tightened. "Because I was a fool," he said, the self-condemnation stark. "I was arrogant. I let my anger and my pride blind me. I convinced myself it was a ploy, a tactic to gain leverage. I listened to the wrong people." He shot a brief, ice-cold glance at Victoria, leaving no doubt as to whom he was referring. "I refused to believe it was real. But seeing her here, hearing her tell the truth, I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." He took another step towards Jessica, his hands slightly raised in a gesture of surrender. "Jess," he said, his voice now thick with an emotion she hadn't heard in years, "I am sorry. What I have put you through is unforgivable." The courtroom was utterly still. This was no longer a legal proceeding. It was a confession, a raw public unraveling. Brenda Walsh, sensing a monumental shift, rose slowly. "Your Honor, in light of Mr. Westwood's testimony, which directly corroborates my client's account, But Damien wasn't finished. He held up a hand, and the sheer force of his will silenced even her. He looked at Judge Hayes, a new fierce determination in his eyes. "Your Honor," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "I am withdrawing my petition for divorce. I do not want to end my marriage." He then turned to face the entire room, a king reclaiming his kingdom. His next words were not for the judge or for Jessica, but for the record, for the future. And for the sake of absolute clarity, let me state this for the court and for posterity. I, Damien Westwood, am the father of my wife's child. I acknowledge my paternity fully and without reservation." He paused, taking a deep breath, and looked directly at Jessica, a strange, almost awed expression on his face. He seemed to be seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time in years. Then came the twist that no one, not even Jessica, could have predicted. "Furthermore," Damien continued, a slight, incredulous smile touching his lips, "I want to correct the record on one final point. My wife and I are not expecting a child." A wave of confusion washed over the room. Finch looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. Was Damien recanting? Was this some kind of bizarre breakdown? Damien's smile grew wider as he looked at Jessica's stunned face. "We are expecting children," he announced, his voice filled with a sudden booming joy. "Plural. My wife Jessica is pregnant with our twin sons." The bombshell landed with a deafening silence. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. How could he possibly know that it was a secret she and her doctor had only confirmed a week ago? A detail she had been holding back, a private joy in her sea of troubles. Damien's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the answer. The private investigator. The reports. Stadler must have overheard something, a conversation with her mother, a phone call with the doctor's office. The surveillance he had used to wound her had in the end revealed a truth so powerful it had shattered his defenses. He had known. He had known it was twins. And in that moment, the weight of not just one heir, but two, a dynasty, had apparently been enough to break through the walls of pride and anger he had built around himself. Victoria Devereux made a low, guttural noise of pure despair. It wasn't just a baby, it was two sons. The Westwood legacy was not only secured, but doubled, and she was no part of it. Her entire future had just been erased. She stood up abruptly, her face a pale, ghostly mask, and fled the courtroom, her lawyer scrambling behind her. The siege was over. The battle had been won. But as Jessica looked at her husband, this stranger who had just publicly reclaimed her and their unborn sons, she knew the war for their future was just beginning. The aftermath of Damien's courtroom declaration was a media firestorm. The headlines were explosive: Westwood reconciles with pregnant wife in shocking courtroom drama. Billionaire bombshell Damien Westwood to be father of twins. Mistress flees in tears as Westwoods reunite. The narrative had flipped completely. Jessica was no longer the runaway wife. She was the triumphant, wronged heroine. Victoria Devereux, once the polished and powerful COO, was now a public spectacle, the scorned mistress cast out in the most humiliating way imaginable. Damien moved swiftly. He fired Garrett Finch and his entire legal team, replacing them with a firm that specialized in crisis management and family law. He released a single, carefully worded public statement, expressing his profound regret for the private pain made public, and his unwavering commitment to his wife and their growing family. He was in full damage control mode, but for the first time, his actions seemed aligned with protecting Jessica, not just himself. Their first conversation alone took place in a private conference room at the courthouse, a sterile space that felt wholly inadequate for the emotional weight between them. "How did you know?" Jessica asked, her voice quiet. It was the only question that mattered. "Stadler's last report," Damien admitted, not looking at her, his shame palpable. "He recorded a conversation you had on the phone with your doctor. He sent me the audio file yesterday morning. I listened to it. I heard you talking about their heartbeats. 2 of them. I heard the joy in your voice, Jess, and I realized what a monster I'd been." He finally met her eyes, his own filled with a deep, aching remorse. "I was so convinced you were trying to trap me. Victoria, she fed that narrative. She said you were manipulative, that you'd do anything for the money. And I was weak enough, stupid enough to believe her. Because it was easier than admitting I had destroyed the best thing in my life." Jessica listened, her heart a tangled mess of pain, relief, and caution. His apology felt sincere, but years of lies had eroded the foundation of their trust. "An apology doesn't fix it, Damien. You didn't just ignore me. You spied on me. You put me on a witness stand and let your lawyer call me a liar and mentally unstable." "I know," he said, his voice cracking, "and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that up to you, if you'll let me." They left the courthouse separately to avoid the media circus. Damien arranged for a private car to take her to the plaza, where he had booked her a suite, not their old apartment, a neutral ground. It was a gesture of respect for her space. They agreed to talk again the next day to begin the long, arduous process of figuring out what came next. But Victoria Devereux was not the type of woman to disappear quietly into the night. She had been publicly and professionally annihilated. Damien had her escorted from the Westwood Global headquarters that same afternoon, her access revoked, her career in ruins. She had lost the man, the money, and the power. A woman like Victoria, when cornered, does not surrender. She bites. 2 days later, just as a fragile truce was beginning to form between Jessica and Damien, the serpent struck. An anonymous explosive leak hit the Wall Street Journal. It was a meticulously detailed exposé on a series of offshore accounts and shell corporations linked to Westwood Global. The article alleged a sophisticated scheme to undervalue assets in a recent international merger, effectively defrauding shareholders of hundreds of millions of dollars. The documents were too specific, the details too intimate to be from an outsider. It was an inside job, and it had Victoria Devereux's fingerprints all over it. The market reacted instantly. Westwood Global's stock plummeted 20% at the opening bell. The SEC announced an immediate formal investigation. Damien, who had just begun to pull his personal life back from the brink, was now facing the potential collapse of his entire empire. He was in his office, a war room of lawyers and PR executives, when Jessica walked in. She had seen the news, and she knew with absolute certainty who was responsible. "It was her," Jessica said, not as a question, but as a statement. Damien looked up, his face grim, aged 10 years in a single day. "She was my COO for 4 years. She knew where every skeleton was buried because she helped me bury some of them." He gestured to a mountain of files on his conference table. "This wasn't just revenge. This is a kill shot. She's trying to burn the whole kingdom to the ground." His new lawyers were advising him to cut his losses to cooperate to find a scapegoat. The evidence was damning, but Jessica, looking at the chaos, saw something else. She saw a pattern. Victoria was brilliant, but she was also arrogant. Her attack was born of rage, and rage makes people sloppy. "Let me see the documents," she said. Damien looked at her confused. "Jess, this is a mess of SEC filings and offshore tax codes. It's a structure, Damien," she interrupted, her architect's mind kicking into gear. "It's a system. It's a blueprint. You build things, I design them. I find flaws in designs. Let me look." For the next 48 hours, they barely slept. They turned the office into their own investigative hub. While Damien and his team dealt with the financial hemorrhaging and the legal fallout, Jessica sat at the conference table with every leaked document, every financial statement, every email chain. She spread them out like blueprints, her mind sifting through the noise, looking for the underlying framework of Victoria's attack. She wasn't looking for a financial error. She was looking for a design flaw, something that didn't fit, a detail that was out of place. And late on the second night, surrounded by coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches, she found it. It was a series of wire transfers, small but regular, from one of the implicated shell corporations to a Cayman Islands account. The transfers were disguised as consulting fees. But the account wasn't a corporate account. The beneficiary name was coded, but Jessica, using an old list of company aliases she remembered from years ago, managed to decipher it. The account belonged to Conrad Jennings, Victoria's lawyer. But that wasn't the flaw. The flaw was the dates. The transfers had started 6 months ago, long before the divorce hearing, long before Damien had officially ended things with her. Victoria hadn't just been his mistress. She had been actively planning his destruction, siphoning off funds, and building an arsenal against him even while she was sleeping in his bed, and whispering promises about their future. This wasn't an act of a woman scorned. This was a long con, a premeditated corporate raid disguised as a love affair. "My God," Damien whispered, looking at the evidence. "She was never building a future with me. She was building a case against me." Jessica looked at him, her expression serious. She made one mistake. She implicated her own lawyer in the fraud. If Conrad Jennings goes down for money laundering, he'll turn on her to save himself. The venom had been potent, but Jessica had just found the antidote. The fight had shifted again. It was no longer about saving his company from a vengeful ex-mistress. It was about taking down a corporate predator who had almost destroyed them all. And they were going to do it together. The final confrontation wasn't in a court, but in the heart of Damien's empire, the 80th floor boardroom of Westwood Global. Before facing his panicked board members, who were gathered to demand his resignation, Damien and Jessica executed their counterattack. They cornered Victoria's lawyer Conrad Jennings in a side office. He walked in smugly, but his confidence vanished when Jessica calmly laid out printouts of his offshore account, detailing the illegal wire transfers from Victoria. Faced with irrefutable proof of conspiracy and money laundering, and two grim-faced federal agents in the room, Jennings folded completely. To save himself, he gave them everything a signed confession, incriminating emails, and the location of a server detailing Victoria's entire scheme. She hadn't just been a vengeful mistress, she was a corporate predator who had planned his ruin for months. Armed with this undeniable proof, Damien walked into the hostile boardroom. He let the board members voice their fury before his team distributed tablets to each one. On the screens, Jennings's confession laid the truth bare. The leak wasn't a whistleblower. It was a malicious, premeditated attack by a disgraced executive who had shorted the company's stock to profit from the chaos she created. "The SEC has been briefed," Damien announced, his voice echoing with renewed authority. "A warrant has been issued for Ms. Devereaux's arrest. I have already initiated a stock buyback to stabilize the share price. Westwood Global is not collapsing. It is being cleansed." He had not only saved his empire, he had turned his greatest vulnerability into his greatest victory. From the doorway, Jessica watched, giving him a small nod. It was her victory, too. Victoria was arrested hours later trying to board a private jet, her downfall as swift and public as her ambition had been. That evening, Damien and Jessica stood on the terrace of her hotel suite, the city lights glittering below. The silence between them was no longer heavy with betrayal, but with the cautious weight of an uncertain future. "You saved my company," Damien said quietly. "We saved it," she corrected him, her hand resting on her belly. "And it's not what's important. This is." He finally looked at her, his remorse raw and undisguised. "I've listed the Fifth Avenue apartment, and I told the realtor to take the land upstate off the market." He hesitated. "I know I destroyed what we planned to build. But maybe we could build something new there. For them. A place to start over." It wasn't a promise of a perfect future, but it was an offering, a blueprint for a new beginning. Jessica looked out at the horizon, at the endless sky, and thought of the two heartbeats within her. They deserved a chance. "Two big worn leather armchairs," she said, her voice a near whisper. Damien's breath caught. He looked at her, his heart aching with a fragile hope. "In the library," she clarified, a tiny, watery smile gracing her lips. "With a fireplace. That's where we would start." He smiled back, a genuine smile she hadn't seen in years. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an agreement. The first brick laid on a new foundation on a path they might just learn to walk together. And so a story that began with a quiet act of betrayal in a Manhattan high-rise ended not with a dramatic courtroom victory, but with a quiet promise on a hotel balcony. Jessica Peterson didn't win back her husband with a single grand gesture. She reclaimed her life, her power, and her future through strength, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to the children she was carrying. Damien Westwood learned that his empire was worthless without a foundation of trust and family. Their story is a powerful reminder that the deepest betrayals often come from those closest to us, but also that true strength isn't about avoiding the fall, It's about how you choose to rebuild from the ashes. What do you think will happen to them? Can a trust that has been so completely shattered ever be fully restored? Will Damien truly change, or will the pressures of his world pull them apart again? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who loves a story of resilience, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that you won't want to miss. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update.